Welcome to ЛSTHETIC. This is episode 1 on December 21st, 2015. ЛSTHETIC has been a channel for me where I initially started it because I wanted a sandbox channel. I wanted an ability to make videos that I could share with everybody, but for songs that were not featured on the DMT Tapes FL or DMT Rec web labels. I wanted to have a channel that I could dedicate to music that was not in my jurisdiction. Although today, we feature both DMT-FL tracks and non-DMT-FL tracks. ЛSTHETIC originally started because I was a huge fan of waterfront dining. I'm still a huge fan of waterfront dining, especially since he helps me run this label and he's the founder of the DMT Rec chapter of DMT Tapes FL. And I thought it only fitting that if I want ЛSTHETIC to become something else, I still dedicate that something else to waterfront dining. So, this very first episode of this very first podcast, I intend to talk about two of my favorite waterfront dining albums, both of which have come out on DMT Rec within the last few months. I'm going to compare and contrast them, even though every episode of ЛSTHETIC might not have two albums. Some of them might just be an analysis of a single album. Because of these two albums and the fact that I have them both burned onto the same CDR and therefore they're inseparable in my mind, I didn't find it appropriate to separate them for this show. So, I'd like to give both Spells and Sprung their fair due. Before we begin, since this is the first episode, I just wanted to talk about the format I intend to use in these episodes. I intend to start every episode with an introduction, just like this one. You'll see the album covers, you'll see the track listings, you'll see the date of the episode, you'll see all of that. Then we're going to, where in place of what I'm doing right now, by telling you what ЛSTHETIC is going to be, I'm going to introduce the albums. Now, part of introducing the albums is very simple. It's just saying the title, saying the day it came out, saying what label it came on, if any, and then we go straight into what I'm going to do, which are called the 15-second overture. The 15-second overture, which you're about to hear for the first time, is where I take the album, I take every song on the album, or nearly every song on the album, and I just pick my favorite little 1 to 2 second snippets. And I give you a 15-second audio palette of what that album means to me. Now, I know that might sound a little corny, but it's very hard to articulate certain aspects of vaporwave and music in general, because so much of why we gravitate towards it is the feeling we get. And that feeling we get might not be something that can be easily articulatable. Because of this, I think the overtures at the beginning of every episode that show you what the album sounds like is crucial. After the overtures, we're going to talk about 3 key tracks from each album. As said, not every episode will be 2 albums, so in some cases it'll just be 1 album, the 3 best songs that I love. The next one, I'm not going to say the words least favorite track, but every single album you've ever listened to has a song on it that you like less than all the other ones. For this project, since I tend to be friends with and know a lot of the artists, I don't want to say least favorite track. Instead, we'll do a segment on the track that I've heard the least on each album, and why I think it might be the one I've heard the least, rather than saying that it's a lesser good song or one that I don't like, because in many cases, especially on these 2 albums, I like all 9 tracks on Spells, and all 7 tracks on Sprung. After this, I'm probably going to talk about the aesthetic of each album. Now, I understand the word aesthetic has kind of a negative connotation nowadays, but only because most people don't realize how much both aesthetic and curation are a big deal in vaporwave. A big deal in music in general, but the album is only half the music. If you took the exact vaporwave album that you love and changed all the titles, changed the cover, changed the stage name of the person who put it together, you would feel differently. And I believe that in vaporwave we really need to focus on what makes these albums so good, not just say that aesthetic is important. What about the aesthetic is important in each individual case? Finally, after we talk about that, I'm going to do an editorial about unique memories and experiences I've had with each album. This is something that I imagine is also completely relatable, even if I'm happen to talk about things that you know nothing of. I live in Florida. I realize that over 20 million people live in Florida, but that's barely a sliver of our fans. So I'm not going to let the editorials be too long. That's what written reviews are for me. One last thing before we go. As this is the first episode, I cannot promise anything about this. This is the format that I've chosen for the first episode, but do remember, I'm creating the first episode while sampling with this format. I've never made a podcast in general, and I don't know if this even counts as one between being on YouTube and Bandcamp. Having said that, I believe I've said enough. I think it's time to kick back, get the introductions to these albums, and hear the very first 15-second overtures. So, without further ado, ЛСTHETIC Episode 1, Spells and Sprung. 3 key songs from Spells, and 3 key songs from Sprung, but first we're going to do Spells. This is really, really hard. You're asking me to take a 9-track album and only pick a third of it to call the best. But I did a lot of thinking before I even sat down to do this episode, that way I wouldn't fumble in front of the mic. The first song I choose is Silhouette. There's a very distinct kind of song on this album that I cannot get enough of, which is why the second song that I want to pick sounds a lot like this, Vesta. They're both punchy, they're both uplifting, they're both mid-tempo to up-tempo, and they both make me feel really, really good. The last one is actually a little different. It's a little bit slower and a lot more romantic sounding. Probably would have fit well onto Sprung. And that song is Princess. And now, Sprung. While Soda Pop sounds more like the songs on Spells, Lucky Day Yours is more the forte of what Sprung sounds like. Another really romantic song for that is Boo. And you know, as I was putting this together, I decided I'm not going to do the least heard track thing, and here's why. Earlier this day, I chose what the least heard tracks were from both Spells and Sprung, but subsequently I've been listening to them all day while I make this episode, so they're officially no longer the least heard. And I've realized what the new least heard tracks are. Instead of making this a segment in this podcast, I think I'd rather just listen to the album and make it all about what makes them so unconditionally awesome. Especially putting together those overtures and the longer versions of the songs that you all just heard. More than anything, I just want to get into why these albums are both so good. Spells is October incarnate, basically. It was our 191st release, but I knew it was bringing something that the initial 190 hadn't. I'd heard of the Kwanzi genre VHS pop before. It's usually applied to a more chillwave type of vapor, but it usually has original vocals over it. A couple of business casual artists I can think of. The first one, at least anyway, is Whitewoods. Whitewoods does this style amazingly. I really wish it was more of that. And it almost feels like, in a sense, and this may be a silly way to put it, but it almost feels as if Spells has the same sense that that album did, it just is missing the vocals. And in that sense, these feel like perfect templates. I remember one of the Whitewoods songs was also a Topaz Gang song, and I could never tell if it was the vaporwave song being sang over or if they just happened to use the same sample. Either way, I like the idea of people eventually using vaporwave songs for some other genre in the future, maybe in the 2020s or the 2030s. And I don't know, I just feel like if anything, it's albums like Spells that are going to be gone to as the primavera of sampling. Because of the way that these albums are produced by Waterfront Dining, I'm so amazed, I'm so impressed. Every song he does on Spells has such a punchy feel to it. Both in Silhouette and Vesta, I tried to point that out especially. I mean, for me personally, all of Spells, every single October 2nd spent with it is a nutmeg-scented wind off the Suncoast Parkway with the windows down, you know. I go up into Tampa and St. Petersburg and Clearwater, and I usually pick music like this for the drive. It just, I don't know, it puts me into a zone. I usually don't like driving either. In Florida especially, everything's so far apart. Everything is very spacious. If you want to go to cool places, you have to get special passes to go on the quick roads. And just about every time I've spent with both Spells and Sprung together was with that CDR that I burned. So late October, early November. The album cover features, as many by Waterfront Dining do, a girl looking off with severe Gaussian blur over the entire album cover, an elegant font to sign it, Waterfront Dining, and the name of the CD, which in this case is Spells. The Japanese next to the word Spells has an interesting something I actually discovered today, well, part of it today, the other part a few days ago when I was preparing for this. When you go into Google Translate with the Japanese, the two characters, it comes out as the word incantations, which is pretty much spells. But when you separate the two characters, the two words, and you translate them individually, it gives you curse sentence, which is interesting because that can be what a spell is too. But it's interesting because spells aren't always curses, and spells are also not always incantations. Incantations imply that it's being uttered. Curse sentence implies that something negative is being cast upon someone. Spells can have those effects, but then there's, I'm thinking of like fucking Wingardium Leviosa, there's other spells too. So I find that interesting. But even more interestingly, you take the word incantations and you translate it not from Japanese but to what it was recommending to me. It said, do in Chinese simplified. So I clicked translate in that, and it says recommended text with recommend in all caps and text in lowercase. That's an interesting application of the word spells too. It's almost a more propaganda-based idea behind spells, like recommended text. It sounds like the spell book is imploring you to say what's in it. If anything, this is recommended listening. Spells is an album that I've now had 2 months to saturate in, and for Waterfront Dining standards, I'm still impressed. This was Waterfront Dining's 5th album with us. By the end of December, he'll have released 10 albums with us, and very, very quickly into 2016, 11 albums with us. This, though, at the end of 2015, now that it's finally come to that, what a long year, what a great year for music and for vaporwave. But I can finally declare it that Spells really is my favorite Waterfront Dining of his 26, soon to be 27, hey, soon to be 28, releases as of this year. Cassettes are available on Lost Angles, our fellow Vapor Patrons label in Ottawa, and of course, as always, the digital for Spells is free on DMT Rec. This was DMT Rec number 16. Pick it up now. So, on to Sprung. Now, Sprung, on the other hand, is November indoctrination. For Floridians, that means the tiniest chance of making it into the 60-degree bracket. If we're lucky here in Florida, we will have 65 to 70 degrees on Christmas Day. In Tallahassee, which was more inland, it was a lot rainier for my Christmases, but it was always cool out. It says, according to Weather Channel, it will be 90 degrees this Christmas Day for the Tampa Bay area. That sucks. So, unfortunately, we're not going to be in the 60-degree bracket, but there was a period in November where it felt like it might be that way this winter. Today, of course, is the first day of winter, and back when November was in its infancy, which sounds stupid, I guess 3 days into November, we didn't have Sprung yet. By the end of the month, we had Sprung. This came out on Thanksgiving Day, DMT 206, as opposed to Spells, which is DMT 191. I think the sweltering heat in Florida near year-round is why both of our Thanksgivings and our Christmases tend to feel a lot more romantic, because it's so hot year-round that people don't like to be near each other. That sounds crazy, and I know it goes the opposite of that one George Carlin skit about how it must be nobody gets laid in Greenland because nobody wants to get dressed down, but near the equator everyone must get it on all the time. I think it's the opposite. Everyone gets sweaty and gross near the equator, so they don't want to go near each other until it gets cold out. And that's kind of the weird vibe that Sprung has brought about. It's really, really chilly music, but it also warms you up. And it's so romantic. When Waterfront Dining already has that romantic sound in his samples in the first place. And that's, I mean, you can get as technical as you want. You can see the source material that has to do with R&B. Or you can just feel the fact that a lot of his instrumentations just take on a very oxytocinic sensation, if you will. For Sprung, it marks a trilogy of albums for me. He releases 3 albums on 3 separate holidays: Thanksgiving, Christmas Eve, and New Year's Day. Sprung marks the beginning of that. Both Dazzle in December and Pages in January are going to complete that trilogy, but this isn't an official trilogy. This is just one that I'm noticing, and I'm really starting to feel, since I'm now starting to listen to those other 2 albums together with Sprung, as much as I was listening to Spells and Sprung initially. Sprung really is the ultimate waterfront romance album, though, and this is coming from an artist who already makes a generous use of the romance beats trope in his music. Waterfront Dining is all about that, and this is the album where he really, really lets loose upon it. Sprung was Waterfront Dining's 8th album with us, which is probably making you go, what? But because Spells was the 5th album. Well, that's thanks to 2 collaborations, the first 2 in Waterfront Dining album history. The 6th was with Replica Federation in October, and the 7th was with Latrace in November. This technically means Sprung isn't really a sequel to Spells, but in terms of the solo Waterfront Dining repertoire, it is. That's why, another reason at least, that I've chosen Spells and Sprung to do together in this first episode. And you bet that another episode in the future, if there is one, will have Saturday Night Special and Bed and Breakfast, the 2 collaboration albums involving Waterfront, as number 6 and number 7. For this one, though, at the 8th, it's really clear that Waterfront Dining is moving on into some crazy interesting territory. I'm really excited to see what it is, and I'm also excited to show everybody what that entails in terms of December and January. For this amazing November release, Sprung definitely rivals Spells. I've only had less than a month or so to be listening to it, but I know that I'm going to come to love it as much as I do love Spells now. give it another month and hope that Spells hasn't run past it in the marathon anyway, because Spells continues to get all of my love as I make more and more videos for it. The same thing will happen with Sprung, but just don't forget, there's only 7 songs here and 9 over there. I tend to be a little prejudiced to the albums that have more tracks, but doesn't mean that I love this one any less. It just means that I probably have more time spent with that other one in terms of individual visuals, individual memories. And that's a huge thing about the Waterfront Danning catalog as a whole. We're coming up on 28 albums in his entire catalog. That's so many distinct images, memories, titles, samples, and sounds that one artist has managed to incorporate from hundreds if not thousands of individuals all playing music from the 70s, 80s, and 90s. I think it's really amazing to hear what he's doing all together, but on Spells and Sprung he's really reached a new pinnacle.